Right. Just a brief explanation how somebody with my research background ended up being interested in Brexit. I mean, for most of my career, I focused on how diasporas, a process of migration, border regimes since the Second World War have connected the political development, social and cultural development, strategic development of countries along the EU's borders with the strategic, political, social, cultural development of countries at the heart of the EU. If you read my book, which is on Amazon, by the way, Fragmented Fatherland, $25.99, it's, I look at, for example, how a range of different diaspora communities, how they act as a bridge, how their activity in a place like Germany connects or intertwines German domestic politics with the domestic politics of countries like Greece, Croatia, Algeria, Libya, and so on. And for a long period of my career, Britain was kind of not what I was interested in, right? It was a member state of the European Union. It was a place where, for phases of my life, I lived and worked. My life is basically between Britain and Germany, so I am as much a diaspora product as Daniel. It was just something where you worked, you voted in the elections, it was kind of over there, and it was for things to do with colleagues in British politics. And suddenly, with Brexit, Britain became a central aspect of my research. Because by opting to leave the European Union, the UK trades in its status as a member of the European Union for a status as member of the European Union's sphere of influence. It moves from being a member of all the EU governance structures with a degree of space to control and shape their development to a neighbor who, as every other state involved along the EU's borders, would be managed and administered through the European Neighbourhood policy, right? The EU has a framework that is central to its development of handling neighbouring states. And as a result of the Brexit process, suddenly you also had a large community of British citizens on the EU core states, as well as EU citizens in the UK, who start to self-organize and self-identify as a diaspora. Right? And I think that's one of the interesting talk from Daniel yesterday, really reminded me of conversations and research engagement, and also things I experienced before I even became a student in dealing with the Ukrainian community, the Turkish or the Kurdish community, that moment in the 1990s and 1980s, where all of these communities begin to realize that they're in Germany to stay, that they have to organize, not just orient their political and social and cultural activity towards the country of origin, but also have to increasingly focus on defending their interests collectively in the country of settlement. So in many ways, the pathway the British are traveling through in German society or Spanish society, Greek, Italian, Austrian society, French society now, is a pathway that has been traveled by previous communities that have had to defend their collective interests against the German and then the EU states, right? The EU dimension of my work has become increasingly central in the last few years because as we have seen the consolidation of the Schengen zone, as the EU has become increasingly like a state, I mean, this is actually a big debate within my own department, is the EU a state or not? And I tend to fall more in the direction of the EU developing quasi-state and structures of statehood. But as the EU becomes an increasingly state-like entity, its entire political and strategic focus, particularly in shaping the border regime, shaping the borders diasporas cross, make influencing its development increasingly central aspect of all the diaspora communities, not just the British in Europe. If you look at the PKKs, the KCK, the various Kurdish alphabet suit of Öcalan-aligned Kurdish organizations, they have a very, very slick lobbying operation in Brussels. If you look at the UETD, which is the AKP's affiliate in Europe, they have a very strict, slick, backed by the Turkish government, slick lobbying operation in Brussels and engage with EU institutions. Same with the Ukrainian community in Europe, the Russian, Vietnamese community. All of the diasporas have increasingly transferred a lot of their lobbying activity from the nation-state level in the 1980s and 1990s, increasingly to the European level, because as the EU becomes an increasingly powerful entity, perhaps even a form of great power and speed, it becomes in the existential interest of every diaspora in every country of origin to not just focus their diplomatic efforts on influencing the nation-state, but increasingly focusing their primary efforts on lobbying the European Union. Right? So a lot of what the British and Europe are doing matches or parallels a lot of what we've been seeing with all kinds of other diaspora communities in Europe in the last 20 years. But my main focus for my talk today will be thinking about the future relationship. So I've got the title of my talk is, Do You Want to Be My Neighbor? and thinking about what an EU northern neighborhood policy will look like. The EU currently has an eastern neighborhood policy, right? That's an overlapping set of frameworks and policy initiatives coordinated by the accession commissioner, Anastasiani, who's the nominee is Hungarian colleague of Viktor Orban, so it'll be very interesting to see how that develops. And he's sort of responsible for overseeing a set of overlapping initiatives for managing, not just managing relationships with EU states to the east, but also managing those states. We'll come to that in a minute. And there's also a southern neighborhood partnership, partly under the control of the accession commissioner, but also probably going to be partly under the control of Šinas, because that also has a strategic imperative. And we'll come to that a bit as well, where the EU is not just influencing and directing sort of integration initiatives, but increasingly a party of war. I think that's something that the British public opinion and British analysts aren't really aware of, that the EU is a central party to waging a succession of military campaigns in the Sahel that, nominally started in 2013 with Operation Serval, but I would say reached back to 2008, 2009 to the destabilization of Chad and the battles there. But I mean, we can do that in question and answer in a minute, right? So the Southern Neighborhood Partnership is theoretically under Shoshani's control, but there's also a very strong defense and strategic imperative to that, where I think Šinas will also be a central commissioner in defining relationships to states of the South. Now with Brexit, the EU suddenly has a neighboring state to the north that whose relationships with which have to be managed, and that has to be managed, right? And we'll come to that distinction, as I say, in the course of my talk. And this is about sort of gaming out the different kind of directions that might take by looking at a set of different examples along the EU's borders of how the EU interacts with neighboring states and how it manages relationships with them and how it manages them. So I've started with the step slide. Everybody remember the step slide? Right? And I think the step slide is a fascinating document on all kinds of levels. We were talking about the bus yesterday in Simon's talk, and the step slide has done actually something very, very similar from the EU side. It defined the debate. Right? It came out much quicker than the UK government in defining exactly what the parameters of the debate were. And in a sense, I have that tweet I always put up, Troika always wins. Right? And one of the reasons I put that tweet up is once you give the EU the opportunity to define and shape a process, you're dead. Right? Because once the EU controls all angles of the process against a deadline, you as the counterparty, the weaker counterparty, constantly have to operate within parameters that it controls. And every time you try to break out of the parameter, the EU can say, uh-oh, you've broken the rules, you're the one who is to blame. We can now look at possible punitive measures towards you. The Swiss are aware of this process. The Greeks have gone through this process. The Tunisians, the Ukrainians, every neighboring state has faced a kind of troika-like dynamic. Right? I mean, the Troika being the Parliament, in the context of the negotiations, the Parliament, the Commission, and the Council. The Troika in the case of Greece was, of course, the IMF, the ECB, and the Eurozone Commission within the Council, right? But this idea that, this is how the EU doesn't just manage relations with states, it manages states, right? So in that sense, how the EU came in to manage the UK at the start of the Article 50 process didn't come out of nowhere, right? It came out of the result of 40 years of managing relationships with the EU states. So whereas the debate in the UK sort of wafted around these sort of FTAs with like South Korea, Canada, the United States, China, because Britain is a great power, apparently, the EU was looking at the UK as a future neighboring state. It was thinking about how do we manage this country as we manage Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, how we manage Switzerland, how we manage Ukraine, how we manage Turkey. Right? It was in the British were thinking in terms of FTAs, the EU was thinking in terms of neighbourhood policy. And I think there are a lot of different miscommunications and misperceptions between the UK side, but the UK side came in preparing for some sort of free trade negotiation on a grand geostrategic scale. The EU was looking at this as a form of stabilization and political management measured on a localized regional European scale. Right? So again, we have a whole set of miscommunications because the frameworks both sides are thinking in completely go past each other and diverge from each other in terms of results and outcomes. So, managing relations with neighboring states has been a central aspect of European integration. So we're going to look at, I included Tunisia a bit as well because Tunisia is now negotiating a DCFTA. So we're beginning to see the Southern Partnership becoming also a pathway to integration in the EU system. But primarily we're going to be discussing Tunisia, Western Balkans, Ukraine, Norway, Switzerland, and Iceland. right? These are the primary sort of strategic areas where the EU has played a huge role in managing relations, but also increasingly managing the internal affairs of states as they seek access to integrate in the European Union. Pressure to adjust to EU institutions for access to a vast market enables the EU system to rewire the structures of neighboring states. Right? So all these complaints the British have about being a member of the EU, right, and how that affects Britain's political economy and political culture, well, that doesn't change when you leave, even on no deal. Anytime you want, as a neighboring state, you want access to the EU system, the EU will make certain demands. It will set criteria. We've all gone through all of these conversations the last 3 years of the Article 50 process. Even with no deal, when the UK comes back to the table, the EU will still want a whole set of control and oversight mechanisms that we all know from all of these other cases how they function. Just read the Ukraine DCFTA and look at its application in Ukraine. Within a 4-year period, the entire political economy of the Ukrainian state and society, from sector to sector, has been rewired and reconfigured to match EU structures. Right down to, if you go to Volyn, to a local butcher shop, right? They moan and complain, like any butcher shop in Barnsley or Bradford, about how they've had to, it's Brussels and they've told us to that. And it's great because it means you don't die of listeria. But, in essence, right, you have it's not just about managing relations with these states, it's managing these internal affairs of these states to harmonize and synchronize them with the EU system. Now, neighboring, that doesn't necessarily mean that each of these states is in stasis. This is a constantly moving target. This is, I think, a second point I want to emphasize. That the EU system is constantly moving, whether you're inside it or just outside it as a neighboring state. Right? So this idea that there is like a kind of stable equilibrium you arrive at, right? Where we say, this is how it's going to be, this is how this relation is going to be, and we're not going to have to shift anything afterwards, is an illusion. Every neighboring state has to adjust constantly, on a monthly basis. Look at the Verkhovna Rada and its legislative program. Every few months they have to, like in the sausage-making process, they have to now take on EU regulations, adjust them, which they're happy to do. They see it as an improvement in Ukrainian governance. But it's a constant process. Look at how the breakdown in relations of the Swiss is based entirely on this process, that every time the EU adjusts a framework, the Swiss bilateral accords have to be adjusted. So this notion that the UK can arrive at a stable equilibrium as a neighboring state, where it says this is how it's going to be and we don't have to adjust, the UK will be in a constant, endless process of adjustment and readjustment to every new EU structural change. Right? So that's life as a neighboring state. Right? And through Brexit, effectively, the EU moves from being able to shape these dynamics. And there's some good arguments. There might be some good arguments for the UK leaving the EU. We might go into those in the question and answer session at the end of this. But this is simply the reality of being a neighboring state, means that you are constantly, even if you're Russia, constantly adjusting and adapting your own political economy towards what this vast market is doing next to you. You'll notice that I use the term EU system, right? Now, I think that it's important to differentiate between the European Union as an entity of 28, possibly 27 states, with its governance structures and its internal development, and those are the states that, particularly in its core, and I would actually say that the EU core, and we have a Kern-Europa now, is Eurozone and Schengen states. And all those states outside of those governance structures that don't sign up to Eurozone, EPPO, PESCO, Schengen, and the UK would not sign into any of them, or already have a kind of secondary status within the structure because they have very little leeway to shape what are now core pillars of the European integration project. So the EU is a kind of entity, a state, increasingly state-like entity. And then there's the EU system that goes beyond the states of the European Union or the core states of the Eurozone, Schengen, and defense integration, and envelops a whole set of other states that are within these different kind of structures. Because the EU system is effectively a regulatory legal framework that any state that wants heightened access to a whole range of EU single market structures, as well as heightened access in terms of movement of people in and out of the EU, as well as integration with the EU's border regime. So that cuts the Canadians out, say, or the Americans or whatever, because they're not really, that's not a problem for them, being part of the EU's border regime. Being part of the EU's border regime is a big problem for the Ukrainians and the Turks. Right? All of them have to harmonize and their legal frameworks and adjust their entire political culture and political economy to criteria set and structure set by the European Union. That's the EU system. The EU system goes beyond the EU. right? I think that's a crucial point. So let's look at different kind of frameworks in the EU system. So you have sort of associated membership, forms of membership, right? So with high institutional integration, so we have EA and EFTA structures. I think we've all discussed that. So Norway or Iceland are classic cases in point, where you have a highly structured institutional framework that effectively leads to, also gives the EU states a degree of input in EU policy-making processes, but where they also carve out spaces of semi-autonomy for themselves, right, in issues such as customs or energy markets or agriculture, but they have a high degree of integration and still have to take on large parts of the EU's regulatory framework. But it's a kind of stable equilibrium. You have stabilization association states, the SAP states in the Western Balkans primarily, and Ukraine increasingly is going in that direction. These are states that are on an accession pathway, at least in theory, right? But who, through these accession pathways, have a high degree of integration with the single market, but because the main blockage they have to get into the EU often has to do with rule of law criteria, also have to accept a high degree of oversight from the EU system. Right, so the oversight a state like Serbia or Kosovo or Montenegro have to take, or North Macedonia and Albania have to take from EU institutions, goes far beyond anything the Norwegian government has to face. And that's partly because they're also in an accession process, so they have to fulfill a bunch of benchmarks and criteria. Like Norway is not joining anytime soon, so Norway doesn't have to worry about accession criteria. Right, it doesn't have some committee in the enlargement, part of the commission saying, well, you know, you haven't, you know, your rule of law sucks a bit, and some cops have gone nuts, and you've tear gassed your parliament, so it's a problem, guys. The Norwegians don't have to worry about that. They can tear gas their parliament and nothing will happen, right? And then we have deep and comprehensive partnerships with extensive integration, but state-specific structures. That's Ukraine and Turkey, right? So the Turkish customs union is with Turkey. It doesn't share that structure with any other state. The DCFTA, although Ukraine is an interesting case in point, because I think its pathway is very clearly into the single market, not to membership, to single market, right? I think the Ukrainians even sort of relatively open say that realistically as Norway for them, EU membership would be great, but it's not likely with all the territorial disputes with Russia. But you have deep and comprehensive partnerships that contain extensive integration with state-specific structures. But this is high levels of integration, right? But it's state-specific. It's a bilateral kind of process. Right? And you can have different variants of that between Turkey and Ukraine. But again, you have a high degree. I mean, one of the fascinating things about the Erdogan government in Turkey is it makes a huge fuss, you know, the S-400s, right? A huge fuss about sovereignty and power and the strategic depth. Everybody remember Davutoglu? That was always quite sweet. You know, strategic depth and how we're going to be a great power and we want nukes now. Where Turkey is coming. And in the end, their entire trade policy and most of its economic regulatory framework is set by Brussels. I love telling that to Americans, you know, when you have these, a completely different context, when you have these strategic debates at RSI or something, and it's like, yeah, but you do know that Turkey's border and economic and trade policy is basically faxed to it by Brussels. And they're like, really? And I think in that sense, it actually explains a lot of the psychology of the Erdogan regime, but that's for a different workshop. And Russia, and even Russia, to a lesser extent Belarus, I would call them, I mean, this is not my term, this is Mark Galeotti's term, this is integrated adversaries. They're both adversaries, so there's a highly adversarial relationship with the EU because they're seen as sort of threats to both regimes. Yet actually, if you underpick under the surface, you know, one of the reasons the Russian state puts so much effort in trying to influence the EU is they're trying to influence energy market policy. Right? Because Gazprom and all of those structures have to effectively adjust what they do in terms of exports and standards and trade to the EU's energy market policy. So they have to put a huge amount of energy in lobbying and influencing the direction of that. Nord Stream 2 is central to that. And actually, if you also cut a little bit further, like my colleagues at the Russian Institute under Sam Green have done, a large part of the regulations that Russian export firms they call them international standards. International standards is basically we do what Brussels tells us to do so we can export our stuff to the Europeans. Right? So these are adversarial states, but even if you unpack that, even to that extent, even states that are nominally enemies of the European Union, their political economy is being reshaped by the EU system. So the whole step slide is basically shaped by experience in not just managing relations with these states, but managing these states. That, I suspect, is the future the UK faces. Now, there may be good arguments for placing it in that position, but that's not a position great powers put themselves into. Right? So there's also questions about how far can Britain still be recognized as some form of great power if it is in a position where large parts of its domestic political economy is shaped by a neighboring and larger power. Right? So there's several variables can affect the stability of a neighboring state's position in the EU system. So again, this can oscillate. Things can go wrong. They can shift position within the EU system in terms of access and relations to the EU. So migration and border management. So we had the Syrian refugee crisis that hugely affected relations with states like Turkey and North Macedonia and so on. We have also, on a more positive level, the fascinating shift of Ukrainian migration, which was partly to Russia, partly to EU, largely to EU now. So since 2014 and then 2017, you've had a massive move of Ukrainian migrants into the EU labor market. There's all kinds of interesting reasons, ad hoc reasons, why the Ukrainians managed to turn what was supposed to be just visa liberalization for travel purposes into actually pretty much full-on access to the labor market, which is also has some lessons for the UK about how far you can actually control these kinds of processes and how far ad hoc processes mean that things happen that you don't really want. Diaspora politics. If we look at the Turkish state's relationship with the EU, the Kurdish diaspora plays a huge role in affecting calculations and affecting relationships. And again, we have the British diaspora in the EU, but we also have an Irish diaspora. We have a significant Irish cultural diasporic presence in the European Union state, and that can in many ways counteract. And there's also the big question, if Scotland becomes independent, how much do you still have a British diaspora and how much becomes an English diaspora? So that Scots in the EU, through the SNP, have a different channel of influence and a different strategic set of goals. I mean, that's not a question for now, but it's worth thinking 3, 4, 5 steps down the line. Territorial disputes. So we have the Cyprus dispute. So there's a big dispute between Turkey, Cyprus, Greece, and the TRNC, although TRNC interests aren't the same as Turkish interests. There's a big debate about this. About who has access and control to the territorial waters around Cyprus because of gas, because of natural gas, and there's a huge amount of money to be made there. It's a huge deal in the Mediterranean, and one that the UK is ignoring, I think partly to its own peril. Divergent or convergent investment and trade structures are security priorities. Often they overflow. We have a period of trade wars, right? So Turkey doesn't like the customs union. It hates it, right? It wants to cut deals with the GCC states and Qatar and other states in China, and every time they go to the Chinese and say, yeah, we want a deal, the Chinese say, have you asked Brussels yet? Right? And obviously the AKP government does not like this at all. Right? And so even Russia and its gas deals with China is sort of constrained because they need to keep their EU markets happy and keep that in frame, right? So there's all kinds of, and competition with the EU's geostrategic rivals. So there's a big Chinese presence in the Western Balkans, that's of great concern. I would worry as much, if not more, about UAE's role in Serbian politics and West Balkan politics. Because there's a whole subset of attempts to influence the EU indirectly through SIP states and potential accession states. I think Brussels needs to pay attention to prevent that becoming a means through which, say, China or UAE try to affect European policy, EU policy. That's again not an issue for this workshop, but let's think down the line. So Britain or the United Kingdom of England and Cornwall are, part of the EU system, and they're not part of the EU, but they're in a weaker position. Their political system is weakened. That is a kind of potential space to which you can indirectly influence EU policy by affecting a neighboring state and forcing the EU to react, right? And I think London, as we well know, is already prone to lobbying from external actors such as UAE, particularly UAE, Qatar, KSA, but also Angola, Nigeria. They're all there, right? The Chinese state and so on. Right? So a couple of different models of how these things can play out. So you have a convergence of interests out of different reasons. So EA structures provided Norway with a framework that could balance domestic social pressures. So in many ways, the EEA as we know it now is part of an internal Norwegian compromise in the mid-1970s, right? So there was very much a pro-European faction. Could call them Remainers, even though they were just members of the EU for like 8 weeks. And a very sovereigntist faction. And the EEA, as it was worked out, was a kind of a compromise that reached a kind of equilibrium. It was a way of taking the European question out of play and saying we're going to disagree and agree about a whole set of other things about domestic policy in Norway, but the EU issue will just sort of, the EEC issue will just sort of put aside. So a mix of autonomy in some areas with integration in others provides a space for compromise. That's why you have a stable, in a way, the EEA as an agreed way of operating with the EU was actually a convergence of interest because it stabilized Norwegian politics. Right, so here we can see how you can thrive a relatively stable equilibrium. It's not just about stability in terms of relations with the EU, it's stability in terms of your own internal domestic politics. That's one driver that can lead to a convergence of interest. Here we have a framework and a structure, that's great. And it's great because it also means that we have this hugely contentious thing in Norwegian politics we don't really want to fight some endless debate about. We'll call it EEA, we'll put it in a box too difficult to solve, put it over there, we'll call it the EEA. Right? Another way where you can see convergence of interest is Ukraine. right, where integration in the EU, and I think there are some wonderful parallels between Ukraine's relationship with the EU and Ireland's relationship with the EU in terms of cultural attitudes, in which both see integration of the EU system as an act of independence. Not an act of like submitting to some greater power, but a way of breaking free from another colonial power, right? Because Ukraine's relationship with Russia is colonial in the way, and post-colonial in the way in which Ireland's relationship with England or the UK is post-colonial. And the whole, if you look at the whole discourse of Euromaidan, right, and the Maidan uprising was about, we have to get into this European project if we want to save the Ukrainian state, if we want to save the Ukrainian national project from Russian infiltration and Russian attempts to subordinate us. Right? So here's a convergence of interest that has a different dynamic. The Ukrainians are perfectly willing to take in a lot of integration, a lot of oversight, because whatever oversight they get from Brussels is in no way comparable to the kind of pressures they would come under if they were alone with Moscow. You'd rather be alone in a room with von der Leyen than alone in a room with Putin, right? That's in the end the ultimate, you know, bang. That's the ultimate.
Greetings from Vladimir.
Yeah. Oh God, yes. That's disinformatia right there. The equation of European integration. So we've gone through this. So you need to have a kind of balance of domestic dynamics as well as relationship for the EU for this kind of stable neighborhood model to work. You know, you have to have both an internal dynamic as to why a consensus as to why this is worth it, and the Ukrainians has decided that 10,000 casualties in war and losing territories in the east was worth this. You have to think about the extent to which the Ukrainians have sacrificed their army. The Ukrainians have actually sacrificed large parts of their budget to build one of the strongest armies in Europe to enable integration in the EU system, right? That's how much it's worth for them. I think that's also something thinking about in terms of Irish attitudes to Brexit as well, how they're possibly willing to go as far, not in a military sense, but in a strategic sense, right? Or divergence of interest. You can have a breakdown of relationships. And we have two good examples of Switzerland and Turkey. The SVP campaign for 2014. People say that there's no precedent to the Leave campaign in Britain. The SVP campaign and the freedom of movement referendum of 2014 has all the same themes, right? It's really, really interesting. It was actually this final expression of Swiss frustration on the right with its oversight position towards the EU. So the Swiss have a whole range of bilateral treaties that sort of replicate whole aspects of the EU system, and that's the way in which the Swiss can pretend they have autonomy from the EU, whereas in reality they have a large part of what they do is shaped by bilateral treaties where Brussels says this is what happens, the Swiss say we don't want it, oh, okay, we'll have to implement it. Right? And the freedom of movement referendum in 2014 was one where the SVP under the leadership of Blocher and his successors built on all of that resentment and anger, where cantonal citizens of anywhere or somewhere, nowhere or whatever, in St. Gallen or Ticino or some Hütte up near Zaban came out and said, nee, das geht nicht, this is impossible, freedom of movement, we have to control who comes in and out of our country. All the themes are the same. It's like Dominic Cummings was basically in Switzerland in 2014, right? And so what it does, though, is it creates exactly the same crisis, the same break, right? Because the EU looks at this and says, you cannot break your freedom of movement. We've even actually compromised a lot with you, but you cannot break the freedom of movement obligations and expect us to keep the whole other framework in place. So again, this is a warning to the UK. If you cross the EU, it will screw you up, right? And step by step, the European Union has capped or punished or taken out whole aspects of religion. Speak to Swiss researchers. But what's happened to their European funding? Right? Speak to the Swiss people running the Swiss financial market. Nobody in the UK, a lot of people in the UK have, but it doesn't seem to have really penetrated consciousness that if you as a neighboring state cross the EU will do stuff to you. Like this has to be internalized, right? And similarly in terms of the customs union, right, what's very interesting, that Turkey can't afford to get rid of the customs union because so much EU inward investment and Turkish exports in the EU is based on it. But it's a source of immense frustration, particularly in the AKP. And actually, I think there is a connection. I mean, Aaron Stein has been thinking about this actually at CPRI, is thinking about a little bit about how far this whole Turkish militarization and purchase of S-400s and eating ice cream with Putin, how much this is a kind of Ersatzhandlung, an attempt to demonstrate sovereignty because you're so constrained in other areas of policy. You have to make a big show in the military strategic arena, or send drill ships pointlessly into Cyprus waters. Show, look, we're still big because you're frustrated because you cannot renegotiate the customs union. The trust is broken down so much between Ankara and Brussels that customs union is not going to get renegotiated as long as Erdogan is in power. That's hugely frustrating for Turkish exporters. Right? And I think also, actually, in many ways, Ankara has a point. They did get shafted over Cyprus accession. They did. I don't think what Ankara is doing now is strategically smart for Ankara, and it's against the interests of the TRNC. But when they complain, they have a point. Doesn't matter. EU doesn't care. Right? We don't trust you. We won't renegotiate the customs union. We know it's not fair. Sorry. Right? So this is, again, this is what happens when you start getting managed with the EU. This is how these relationships can break down. It's a link between internal domestic instability and instability in the relationship with the EU, and they feed off each other into a cycle of breakdown of relationships. Yet somehow, both sides are still so invested in having some sort of neighborhood arrangement that nobody ever entirely pulls the trigger in breaking down the entire system. So you end up with a dysfunctional relationship full of downs more than ups going on decades, but nobody ever is going to kill the Turkish accession process entirely. Right? And clash of interests. And I think it's very important, by the way, before speaking of Russia, is in analyzing Moscow's actions, it's crucial to differentiate between what might be in the interests of Russian society and what might be in the interests of the regime. It's very, just as a kicker, not whenever we discuss Russia. What I'm going to say now might not be in the interest of the Russian society and economy, it's in the interest of the regime. So for Putin's first 2 terms, he was speaking at the Bundestag in 2002, Putin really tried to cultivate the European Union. And at some point, there's a big argument, was it 2007, 2011, 2013? The regime realized that if they actually followed through on all this European integration, like the DCFTA, all the rule of law provisions, all the transparency provisions, all the ways in which particularly Russian businessmen and Russian oligarchs, however you want to define it, would have a way of sort of protecting their property from the state, that threatens the foundations of the Putin regime. Right? So these are protests in Moscow. This is the war in Donbass. Those two are intimately connected. He goes to war with Ukraine, not just about Ukraine, but because he sees European integration as a threat to his own internal regime structures. Now, the problem for Russia, again, is it's still too exposed to European gas markets, too exposed to European export markets. It can't ditch the relationship. So again, you have a process of permanent clash where both can't entirely break free from one another. They're both intertwined, but both are adversarial. And this can last for a very, very long time. So, final point. UK is a neighboring state. Convergence, divergence, or clash. Right? EU management of other neighboring states shaped its Brexit process. I think that's a core thing that keeps to be in mind. It's not relations with the EU or China or all these other states. It's the neighborhood policy that has shaped the EU's strategic approach to the UK. Entrenched narratives of exceptionalism in the UK hampered the ability of the British state, not just the British state, but I think almost every British political, intellectual, cultural, social actor to realize what is being done to it. It's like a boiling a frog. I mean, this metaphor is used a lot. But you still think that there is a real psychological block in the UK to entirely realize what is being done to it in the process of becoming a neighbor. Possible trajectories to the EU's northern neighborhood. Convergence, but you need a domestic consensus over relations with the EU and other issues to have a stable framework. Right? You have to have some sort of stable consensus in the UK to say this is fine, this is okay. We're leaving the EU because we don't want to end up dragged into the Eurozone or Schengen or the EPPO. That might be good arguments for Brexit, actually. There is a liberal leave argument. You could maybe, Divergence, lack of consensus over relations with the EU, and political actors, Erdogan, using it, escalation of the EU to mobilize support and destabilize the frameworks, right? If you have a highly polarized, contentious internal debate where escalating against external actors, be it the United States, be it the EU, be it China, becomes a means through which to mobilize support, you're not going to really find a long-term stable equilibrium. This will be a constant process of clash and renegotiation. The idea, prevalent in much British debate, that somehow you find a deal and this all goes away, it's going to go on forever, right? I mean, whether you remain or leave, it's going to just go on and on and on. You just have to live with the fact that British debates the European Union. Britain cannot relocate itself to where Taiwan is. Does it really want to? That's a different question. Right? As long as it's where it is, it's going to have to manage relationships with the European Union, right? Clash. And then you can have a fundamental clash, right? In which, in the end, you have a state neighboring the EU that is both economically integrated with it, but does everything to undermine the basic structures of the European Union because it sees it as a threat to its own internal regime stability or political structure or ideology, right? And again, the Russian case provides a very, very good example where you can be both integrated in the European economy, but also in a fundamental adversarial relationship, not because it might be in the wide interests of state and society, but because of a specific faction in power at a specific moment in time sees European integration as a fundamental strategic threat to their domestic position. So the outlines of Brexit debate, it provides indications each of these scenarios is possible. Right? I mean, this is where I can't give you an answer. I can't say it's going to end up like Russia or end up like Turkey or end up like Ukraine or Norway. I can't say that. Brexit debate in the UK shows possible pathways, or Dominic Cummings would call them branching histories, in all three of these possible directions. But what the British really have to sort of face up to is, if you become a neighbor, the EU doesn't just manage its relations with you, it manages you. Right? And until that psychological block or threshold is crossed in British society, because, I mean, there is this thing about British strategy towards the EU tends to be waiting for the EU to go away, or hoping that some other state splits off, and that's not going to happen. Right? You're stuck. And if you're a neighbor, you're going to have to deal with this colossus next door and face the fact that it isn't just managing relations with you, it's managing you. Right? So that's the end of my talk. Thank you.